You're listening to the Vocabbett podcast, where I help students improve their vocabulary for the SAT, ACT, and life itself using my unique and research-backed story-based method. On this podcast, I'm sharing the best tips and tricks for a more enriched vocabulary and pain-free test day. Hello, and welcome to episode 72 of the Vocabbett podcast. I'm Erica Abbott, a former English and history teacher, the author of the young adult novel Ahead of Her Time, and the founder of the eponymously named vocabulary company Vocabbett. We are currently boosting our vocabulary by telling stories of extraordinary women from history. We started with my famous ancestor, Sarah Josepha, then moved on to the medieval warrior lady Ethelfled, eschewing chronological sensibilities with reckless abandon. We're jumping all over the timeline here. We're going to talk today about a female pirate from the 1700s. Anne Bonny is one of the few female pirates whose name lives on from the so-called golden age of piracy. And she made a really big name for herself in a really short period of time. Anne Bonny was arrested and sentenced to death at age 24. But before all that, let's back up and start at the beginning. Anne Bonny was the daughter of a lawyer and his servant, not his wife. But Anne was lucky in the sense that her father seemed to genuinely care about her. This type of relationship between the so-called master and servant or slave was unfortunately not uncommon throughout history, but the progeny were often swept under the rug. That didn't happen to Anne. The other unusual thing about her parents' relationship was the fact that her father seemed to actually care about her mother, the servant, more than his actual wife. This is probably why his wife eventually left him. The details of what happened and when are a little bit fuzzy when it comes to her childhood, but it seems like Anne's father was basically always involved in her life. He is probably the one who gave her the idea to dress as a boy when she turned into a pirate later, because as a child, he actually dressed her as a boy so she could receive legal training. After she was born, he said she was the child of a friend who died and he'd been asked to step in as guardian. But since the whole story was made up anyway, he also said she was a boy so that she could get a better education. Now, the wife of Anne's father left him at some point in all of this, and eventually the scandal broke that the little boy working for that lawyer was both a girl and his illegitimate daughter. At this point, her dad took her and her mom to America, modern-day South Carolina. And they actually did pretty well there by contemporary standards. When they got to America, the three of them just started saying they were a family: husband, wife, and daughter. That's the story they stuck to, and no one really challenged it. Dad opened a successful legal practice, then moved into merchandise, which was even more lucrative, and was eventually able to buy a small plantation. So again, they did well by contemporary standards, the standards of the time, con meaning with and temp meaning time, the standards with that time. Obviously, slave labor is morally repugnant, and given that they were in South Carolina in the 1700s, it's fairly certain that there were slaves at this plantation, which is obviously disgusting. Anne's mom died when she was around 14, and I want to read you an excerpt from A General History of the Pirates about what came next. This book was written by the so-called Captain Charles Johnson in 1724, just a few years after Anne was sentenced to death. But Captain Charles Johnson wasn't a real person. It was a publishing pseudonym, a fake name. But anyway, here's what this so-called Captain Charles Johnson had to say about Anne Bonny as she started growing up after her mom died. Quote, "She was of a fierce and courageous temper, wherefore, when she lay under condemnation," so when she was about to be executed, "several stories were reported of her, much to her disadvantage, as that she'd killed an English servant maid once in her passion with a case knife while she looked after her father's house. But upon further inquiry, I found this story to be groundless." End quote. So this is my translation now. Basically, before she was about to be executed, a bunch of rumors started flying around about her, like that she'd killed one of her servants. But when this guy looked into these rumors, he found it to be groundless. The so-called Captain Johnson continues, "It was certain she was so robust that once, when a young fellow would have lain with her against her will, she beat him so that he lay ill of it for a considerable time." End quote. So, my translation: what is certain about her temper is that at one point, some guy tried to force himself on her and she beat the crap out of him. Johnson goes on, "While she lived with her father, she was looked upon as one that would be a good fortune, wherefore it was thought that her father expected a good match for her. but she spoiled it all, for without his consent, she marries a young fellow who belonged to the sea and was not worth a groat." End quote. So translation, she was looked upon as coming from a good family, she was pretty, she had money, it was thought that she'd make a good match, but she spoiled it all by marrying a lousy pirate. The quote goes on, "This provoked her father to such a degree that he turned her out of doors, upon which the young fellow who married her, finding himself disappointed in his expectation, shipped himself and wife for the island of Providence, expecting employment there." End quote. And okay, I'm done with the quotes now. But essentially, translation there is that her husband had expected to inherit a bunch of money, but the dad disowned both of them, and so they went to the island of Providence, which is in the Bahamas, which was basically pirate HQ at the time. So at this point in our story, we have a girl who had an unusual early start to life, but has been raised for many of her formative years as basically a rich young woman in Carolina. She was expected to make a good match, a good marriage, and then she runs away with a pirate. Anne and her husband, James Bonney, get to the Bahamas, and at that point she realizes what a total loser he is. I don't think she minded that he was a pirate, but she was disappointed by what a bad pirate he was, and not in a hot Johnny Depp circa 2003 kind of way. Once they got to the Bahamas, James Bonney basically made his money by turning in his old friends and collecting the ransom on them. Anne found this terribly unromantic and took up with a different pirate, Calico Jack Rackham, who is now often credited with creating the iconic skull and crossbones pirate flag, the Jolly Roger. Now, Anne Bonny, like Cleopatra, has been portrayed many times throughout history in different stories and movies and TV shows, and everyone kind of has a different take on who she really was. When you think about how many rumors fly around today, and that's in an age with mass communication and the ability to almost instantly verify something, you can only imagine how many rumors flew around back then, when you could basically say anything and who'd really know the truth. The general history of pirates thing is a good example. Before she was about to be executed, there were all these rumors that she'd killed a servant girl and burned her father's house down after she was disowned. And, I mean, who would really know what had happened in Carolina 1,000 miles away? But the author, after some actual research, didn't find evidence for any of this. The only evidence he really found of her being violent before she left Carolina was the fact that she beat a man half to death after he tried to assault her. So part of the reason it's difficult to discern fact from fiction is just the nature of the times. She wasn't a head of state. There weren't people writing books about her and watching her every move, and rumors were flying left and right. But there's an added difficulty in this case in the fact that Anne deliberately encouraged these rumors when she was alive. To be a woman was hard enough throughout a lot of history, but to be a woman on a pirate ship in the 1700s gave Anne a whole new set of hurdles to overcome. You probably already know that it was considered bad luck to have a woman on a ship back in the day, but you might not have known quite how seriously people took that superstition. According to Smithsonian Magazine, the magazine of the Smithsonian, the policy on the famous Blackbeard's ship was that if a woman were to be found on board, she would be immediately strangled and pitched overboard. People were terrified of having women on their ships. So to silence these guys, Anne had to make them more afraid of her than their superstitions. And again, everyone has an opinion on who she really was, but my take is that she was obviously extremely tough and fearless, but she also kind of enjoyed the game. There's a story about when she first started out with Calico Jack, and by this point, she's basically dressing as a woman. She would dress as a man sometimes when they were fighting, but in general, when she was with Calico Jack, she was openly living and dressing, even on the ship, as a woman. But she had to kind of earn the right to be a tough woman on a ship. And the story goes that on one of her first raids out with him, in order to kind of establish her chops, so to speak, she got a mannequin, like a fake body that they used to put clothes on. And she distorted all the limbs to make it look like this guy was seriously injured, covered him with fake blood from the kitchens, or I guess it was real blood, but it was from an animal. So she smears all this blood all over the mannequin, distorts the limbs to make it look like he's got all these broken bones. And then on a full moon, she has Calico Jack sail past this ship that they're about to attack, and she just stands on the deck, a woman on the deck, with an axe over this mangled body, and was like, "Hey guys, who's next?" The people on this other ship were so terrified they surrendered without a fight. So yeah, all those guys probably went and told the story that she was this psycho, and to an extent she probably was, but not necessarily in the way they thought. It was a mannequin. So she strikes me as someone who wanted the adventure but didn't want to actually hurt anyone unless it was in self-defense. Her violence did become more real the longer she spent as a pirate, though. When Calico Jack would go take over other ships, she would join in the fighting. On her last fight, when she and Captain Jack and all of the rest of the crew were captured, she and Mary Read, another female pirate who I don't even have the time to get into, but there was another female pirate on this ship who also for a while was disguised as a boy, but then Jack knew she was a girl and was fine with it, etc., etc. But anyway, it's said that she and Mary were the last two to surrender, that they fought until their last breath, and that pretty early on, the other guys were so feeling the effects of a previous night's indulgence that they stopped fighting and barricaded themselves below deck when they realized they were not going to win this fight. Anne Bonny was so ticked that they had surrendered that she's like calling up to them. She's challenging their manhood. She's like, get out here and fight with me. What are you guys doing? If we get captured, we're going to get executed. Get up. And one of the guys said like, no, and shut up, basically. And she shot him in the face and then went on to continue fighting the governor's men. So this is a woman who eventually became legitimately violent, not a good person, but remarkable in the sense that her story is worth remarking upon. It's worth talking about. She did not take the standard path for women in the 1700s. After she was arrested, all the men on the ship were executed, but she and Mary were granted a stay of execution. Basically, the execution was delayed because both of them said they were pregnant. The other girl, Mary Read, probably was and died in jail, most likely as a result of giving birth. But what happened to Anne has never been definitively determined. The History of Pirates book just says, what has become of her since we cannot tell. Only this we know, she was not executed. End quote. All right, I hope you enjoyed learning about another forgotten woman from history, a woman you probably didn't learn about in school. We've been bouncing all over chronologically, but we've been pretty America and England-centric these first few episodes. So next time, we're heading over to the Middle East. I'll see you then.